Okay, so Mike, thank you so much for giving the time to come onto the podcast.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So just to give a brief overview for the listeners who may not have heard of you before, what it is that you do at the moment.
Yeah, so I do kind of a mix of online training. I have some certifications. I teach for Rocky Mountain University, Georgia Southern University, faculty member at the Carrick Institute. They do primarily clinical neurology, functional used to be called functional neurology. And yeah, probably a combination of all those things. Most of the stuff I do is online training and different certifications, kind of educational products I have and speaking in the fitness space.
Great. Yeah, so nice and broad.
Yeah,
And
a little wide variety there.
I find that most people do have quite a broad range of things that they get stuck into. It's that sort of personality that likes to do a lot of different things, I find.
Yeah, and trying to help with a little bit of a couple of research papers in the works and things of that nature too. So yeah, I would agree.
Great, nice. Well, let's get straight into it then. So we're here today to
Sure.
talk about metabolic flexibility. And so, I mean, just for the listeners again who may not have heard of this topic before, could you just give us a brief rundown of what exactly it is?
Yeah, so metabolic flexibility is on one end of the spectrum, how well can your body use carbohydrates? On the other end of the spectrum, how well can your body use fat? And then how well can you switch back and forth between the two? In fitness, it's kind of weird that people always argue about what the best fuel is. And the reality is it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to lift a fair amount of heavy weights or do some intervals, then carbohydrates are going to be your friend. If you're just kind of hanging out and, doing some low intensity work, then I'd argue fat's going to be a better source of fuel. So it just kind of depends on what it is you're trying to do and making sure you can maximize actually both of them and then switch back and forth as needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you said, it's funny that we do get into the debates within the fitness industry about carbs over fats, because there is definitely a lot of hype of becoming fat adapted and then using that as a fuel source for higher intense activity.
Yeah, the problem with that is I agree that becoming more fat adapted, right, which I don't really like the word, but teaching your body to use fat at a higher percentage, I think is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've tested some people on a metabolic cart, and which is just a fancy piece of equipment that can tell you what fuel they're using. And a handful of people, even at low intensity work, are still burning a fair amount of carbohydrates,
Mm-hmm.
which I would argue probably not the best, especially from a health standpoint. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you can get fat use up relatively high, but bioenergetically, you'll never be able to compete with carbohydrates if you're doing something where you have to produce energy at a very, very fast rate. So if you're doing, say, 500 meters on a rower or some type of interval training or something where speed and power lasting longer than a few seconds is of a high importance, you can't really compete with carbohydrates to fuel that level of ultra high intense exercise.
Mm-hmm.
We see this on athletes who are keto adapted, right? That with those athletes, you lose about 3 to 8%, maybe somewhere around there off the top for speed and power.
Right.
Now, if you're not a high level athlete and you don't do a lot of speed and power stuff, that may not matter. So who cares? But if you are an athlete and you like doing that kind of stuff, or you just like having more performance in that area, single digit percentage is a pretty massive difference just by changing fuel sources.
Yeah, quite a substantial one as well when you're in that area of trying to eke out every small gain.
Oh
But
yeah, it's a huge difference then.
yeah, massively. I think that was quite interesting though what you said about actually becoming, well, not, as you said, you didn't like the word fat adapted, and I completely agree, but using fat as a fuel source more regularly is a good thing for most people, especially from a health point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess talk a little bit more about that. I guess you're finding that a lot of people are just unable to use fat when they're at rest because of a higher carb diet.
I wouldn't say it's a lot of people. It depends on what you look at the research, but
Mm-hmm.
the research we do have shows that how well people use fat as a fuel source during low intensity exercise is really variable, meaning some people are pretty good at it already and some people aren't, right?
Hmm.
If you open most physiologic textbooks, they would say, oh, it's low intensity exercise, therefore everyone's really, really good at using fat. That's the primary fuel source.
Hmm.
And that's true if we look at averages of people, and especially healthy people, and especially most athletes. However, if we look at the range of how adapted people are to using fat, to use that terminology, it varies from about 10 to 93%, meaning that some people, when they did a couple studies, so Helge did one study back in the 90s, Gadecki did one study, I actually did one study, and what they all kind of found was that at lower to maybe even moderate intensity exercise done in a fasted condition, some people were really good at using fat, and some people even standardized to the same exercise intensity of their max. So, trying to make sure it's relatively the same percentage for each person. Some people were just horrible at using fat as a fuel source.
Right.
So it's not, I would say, a given that just because it's a low intensity exercise, oh, you must automatically be using a high percentage of fat. There's a
Hmm.
high amount of difference from one person to the next when we look at testing.
Right. Yeah. So it's just from a textbook, we would say, right, okay, lower intensity exercises, we use more fat as a fuel source. And as the exercise intensity increases, we use more and more carbohydrates as a percentage.
Correct.
But not with all people, as you said there, through research. So what is that down to genetics then? Is that down to lifestyle? What kind of thing brings upon that inability to use fat as a fuel source?
Yeah, we probably don't know entirely for sure. It's probably all of the above.
Hmm.
Um, It is true that if we push up your VO2 max, so kind of the maximal amount you can use oxygen to fuel for
Hmm.
aerobic exercise, in general, the higher your VO2 max, the more fat you will use. Kind of like VO2 max is sort of the aerobic equivalent of your weightlifting 1 rep max, except for on
Hmm.
the aerobic side of the equation. So I think that can play a role in it. We do know that VO2 max in and of itself has a high genetic component. Look at
Hmm.
studies like the Heritage trial that was done at the University of Minnesota. And anecdotally, from talking to some endurance athletes, the ones I found in general who are really good were, if they were tested early on, their VO2 max was already relatively high. And granted, they did a lot of good training. They probably bumped it up a little bit more. They can bump up other parameters and stuff too. But genetically, I think there's a big component with that. There may be a big genetic component related to how well we can use certain fuels, although some of the studies that have kind of hinted at that haven't really panned out that well. So if you look at the Diet Fit study that Dr. Chris Gardner did, the previous work to that did some genetic testing to try to look at what is the kind of best fuel for each person. There was some kind of positive associations with certain genes that, maybe you should use more fat, maybe you should use more carbs. But when they
Right.
did a big study on that and they kind of fed people according to their genetics, it didn't really pan out all that well.
Right.
So my guess right now is things that we know will destroy it are super high stress, very, very high carb diets combined with metabolism that's not very good, such
Hmm.
as even pathologies, type 2 diabetics, things of that nature. I wouldn't say it's necessarily carbs itself per se. So the lack of sleep will definitely do it. You become very metabolically inflexible after 4 nights of poor sleep. They
Hmm.
did that study, I think it was University of Illinois. It was for, I want to say, 4 nights. They normally had 8 hours of sleep, and they cut their sleep to 4 hours per night. And they had all sorts of kind of metabolic changes with that. In short, they had a hard time using carbohydrates and had a hard time using fat. So they became very metabolically inflexible just from 4 nights of very impaired sleep. So it's probably all the above. And the other big one, too, I've seen is something people don't think about a lot is if you're only doing weight training and you're
Hmm.
on a very high carbohydrate diet and your meal frequency is relatively high. I've seen some of those athletes test not so good for using fat at rest.
Hmm.
And even I've seen a couple pretty high level endurance athletes who are exercising a lot. Granted, their intensity was probably higher than I think it should have been. And they were consuming a ton of carbohydrates all the time. and the performance was pretty good. I mean, some of them were pretty top runners, but when we looked at the crossover effect, they didn't even have a crossover effect,
Right.
meaning they never even got below the 50% point. So they were really, really good on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. And as long as they could keep enough carbohydrates coming in from a pure performance standpoint, they're probably going to be okay. Although I would argue from a health standpoint and sustainability and a bunch of other things, yeah, probably not the best direction to go.
Yeah, because they just don't have that backup plan, really, do they? They don't have the ability to use fat in that aerobic pathway.
Correct. Yeah, it's definitely turned down by quite a bit. It's not entirely blunted, but it's definitely turned down to a high degree.
Yeah, so they just need to basically keep feeding themselves with carbohydrates to keep that performance up because they basically don't have like a backup engine.
Yeah, it's like running the hybrid only on one fuel and the other one's broke.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, as long as you can, keep the battery charged, you're okay. But if, you can't run the gas engine because there's no gas.
Hmm. So talk to us a little bit more about then this benefit of why it is a necessity from a health point of view to be able to use both, right? So we've got these high level athletes who are um, using carbohydrates mainly as fuel sources, and they're performing okay. But as we said there, they haven't got that backup engine. But from a health point of view, why is it so necessary for us to be metabolically flexible to be able to use both?
Yeah, so on more of the fat end of the spectrum at rest, most of what we're doing just hanging out is fueled by aerobic metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
So aerobic metabolism, people already know, you can mainly use oxygen for that. So how well can your little mitochondria take oxygen and convert it into ATP, right, to create and burn different fuel sources? So on the aerobic end of the spectrum, we can use either fat or we can actually use carbohydrates. So a lot of people get down in the weeds and they're like, oh, but aerobically burning more carbohydrates, you get a little bit more energy from it. And that's actually 100% true. But when we're at rest and low intensity exercise, we don't need a large high intensity. Like we don't have to worry that much about time, right? The
Mm-hmm.
faster you go, the higher intensity you go, then yes, that rate of how fast can you create energy, that definitely becomes a limiter. But at rest, because the intensity is not that high, resting metabolic rate or even low intensity work, fat, in my opinion, is better because there's less, let's say, potential kind of, I don't like the word side effects, but maybe like production of reactions in oxygen species. It's more efficient. We can create a lot more fuel from the same amount of fat compared to carbohydrates. So,
Mm-hmm.
from that standpoint, from a metabolic efficiency standpoint, it's actually a more efficient fuel. Most people have some concern about body fat. So while how much fat you burn isn't the entire part of the equation, it's definitely a big part of the equation. You can
Mm-hmm.
burn more fat as a fuel. You have a better chance of having a better body composition. All other things being equal. There's some long-term mouse studies and a few other things that have kind of hinted at other health factors that we probably haven't entirely figured out yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, being able to use carbohydrates is helpful for fueling higher intensity exercise.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there's cases of a disease which is called McArdle's disease. They're actually missing genetically one of the enzymes, this glycophosphorylase enzyme, that allows the body to take glycogen, so stored carbohydrates, as fuel and take that and break that down into energy. So they're missing this enzyme genetically and they can't do that. So they actually have stored carbohydrates as glycogen, but they can't tap into them and they can't use them. And what we find is even like moderate to high intensity exercise for these people is just horrible. It
Mm-hmm.
feels bad. Their performance is bad. They have a lot of muscle pain, risk of rhabdomyolysis. Breaking down extra muscle for energy is also very high. And that's not going to be good either. So you probably want to use both. It just depends on what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think in the future we'll have more data on that. If we look at the direct opposite of that, so we say, okay, what happens when we start losing the ability to use carbohydrates and losing the ability to use fat? We
Mm-hmm.
become very metabolically inflexible. And that's actually a marker or hallmark of diseases like type 2 diabetes.
Hmm.
So type 2 diabetics, if the disease progresses, they actually become very metabolically inflexible. So
Hmm.
we know on the other end, if we lose metabolic flexibility, we're actually getting closer to a disease or a pathology state.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, it comes down to, um, I guess to start improving this within people, it's a case of you're going to need to be ingesting both food sources, and I guess exercising at those different intensities to get your body to use them. Like, how would you say that? Let's say that someone's metabolically inflexible, but it's because they only use carbohydrates and they're not using fats as fuel sources. What's the journey for that person?
Yeah, so for that, we're going to look at what things will push the body to use more fat as a fuel source.
Hmm.
From a hormonal standpoint, the main one's probably going to be insulin.
Hmm.
Insulin is a fuel selector switch. I stole that phrase from Dr. Jeff Volek. So high levels of insulin is going to push the body to use more carbohydrates. Low levels of insulin is going to push the body to use more fat as a fuel source. So if we want to upregulate fat as a fuel source, we probably want to do it in more of a fasted condition, right? Which gets into the whole fasted cardio debate and all the stuff surrounding that.
Hmm.
But we do know that when you do fasted to low intensity to moderate intensity cardio
Hmm.
in most people, right? Again, this is pretty high variability, like we discussed, but that is pushing the body to use more fats as a fuel. You can look up in literature something called an MFO or max fat oxidation point. So
Hmm.
I would have people do low to moderate intensity cardio, probably first thing in the morning. So for some people, depending on how deconditioned they are, that may just be walking. I do a lot of stuff with the rower. I find that's pretty useful. If you
Hmm.
don't know and you don't have a heart rate strap to look, you can kind of use the Phil Moffatone equation, which is 180 minus your age. So
Hmm.
180 minus your age. So if you're 40, 180 minus 40, your max heart rate for that kind of staying sub maximal is going to be about 140.
Right.
Again, if you're an elite athlete, that's a pretty low number, but
Hmm.
that gives you kind of a marker of where to hang out at. If you don't have a heart rate, then you can just try doing something where you can only breathe through your nose,
Hmm.
right? So if you kind of limit airflow, the data on that hasn't really been published yet, but from some of the authors, they kind of hinted that that seems to map out to staying kind of in that aerobic area, low to moderate intensity area. So that's one thing I'm trying on myself to see, how true that is. I'm trying to grab some people and just do some anecdotal testing on that.
Hmm.
But yeah, that definitely works. On the nutrition side, you may have days of lower carbohydrates.
Hmm.
You may do some fasting, something like that. You're going to do things where you're going to overall kind of lower your insulin levels. And of course, the trump card and kind of all of it is, are you in a caloric surplus or a deficit? And it appears that you probably want to be in a little bit more of a deficit to help with that also.
Right. To kind of encourage that body to start to oxidize fat more as a fuel source and just get used
Right.
to.
Right. And most people in that boat are probably going to be looking for body composition changes too, right? In
Hmm.
order to have that happen, you have to be in a caloric deficit.
Sure. Because most people, I guess, they're getting to a stage where they're metabolically inflexible will be more of the people who are overweight and struggling, as you said, like type 2 diabetics and stuff as well.
Yeah, I would say in general. But again, like I said, there are some athletes, there are some cases where it can go the other way. But I would agree with that in general.
Yeah, just talking with broad sweeping statements.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think that was a good. I've never thought about that idea of just breathing through the nose to halt someone's sort of intensity, because that's always the
Hmm.
key. That's always a tough one to work with if someone doesn't have a heart rate monitor and you're like, we want this to be like very low intensity aerobic activity, and they're like, yeah, I got you, coach, and
Yeah, yeah.
they're far too hard. So
Yeah. They used
that
to use
may.
the old what they call talk test, right? As
Mhm.
long as you can still talk to someone that's probably low intensity and there's some okay data around that too. But the silly humans kind of lie about that.
Mhm.
It's yeah. You know right away if you're breathing through your nose or your mouth, right? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is it's a great little tip. I'll have to try it. But I think it's a good thing for the athletes listening as well, who will want to improve their performance in all ranges, right? If they've got to do long distance events as well as short high intensity events, if they're just eating a ton of carbohydrates and training at a high intensity all the time, those long events they're probably going to struggle with. So if they incorporate some longer fasted aerobic training in the mornings, then they're going to be putting themselves in a good position.
I would agree with that. I mean, depending on where they're at and what's going on. The other part too, people forget is that for on the lifting side of the equation, the recovery between sets and between sessions is actually primarily driven by aerobic metabolism.
Right.
Right. So if I do old school Bill Starr 5x5 on deadlifts, my recovery from one set to the next is actually an aerobic component. So lifting the weights is an anaerobic, does not need oxygen to do it. But recovery from those in between is actually aerobic. So if I am more aerobically fit, I can recover faster interset from one set to the next. And because the recovery part is driven primarily by aerobic metabolism, I can probably recover faster between one session versus the next session. So people I've seen, if someone comes to me and says, assuming their training is somewhat intelligent and set up right, and they're like, man, I can only train 3 days a week. The first thing I would look at is obviously making sure the nutrition's good, making sure they're recovering, they're getting enough calories, etc. But another component that people forget to look at is what is their aerobic capacity. If their aerobic capacity is crap, their resting heart rate is 71, they probably just don't have the ability to mitigate and to kind of recover from that stimulus. So by pushing up their aerobic metabolism, they can then usually add another maybe 1 or 2 or more sessions per week, be fully recovered, and still maintain a high quality of performance.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, because it's, as you said before, there's a bunch of lifestyle considerations that you need to take into account with these kind of things as well. Like if people are getting really poor sleep, they're chronically stressed, those things are all going to have a massive part as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And if we just look at stress and we're like, okay, so we've got our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, right? So parasympathetic is rest and digest and recovery, like pushing the brake down on your car. The sympathetic side is more like pushing the gas pedal down on the car. So stress response, right? Fight or flight. If we look at that, the fuels actually map out pretty good with that. If you're more rest and digest, you're going to use more fat as the main fuel. As we become more stressed, we're going to switch to use carbohydrates as the main fuel. So what I'd like to see, and there's not a ton of data on this, is I think that's probably a two-way street, not a one-way street.
Right.
Meaning that if we can reduce somebody's stress overall, I think we will shift them to actually use more fat as a fuel. That also coincides with people like yourself and other trainers who generally report that the clients they have a harder time seeing body composition changes are ones that are also very high stress. Granted, there's a bunch of other behaviors usually associated with that and using food as a coping mechanism, etc. But maybe there's something to just change in substrate utilization. And then the other part too is if your body is really tuned to using carbohydrates all the time, it can't switch over to use fat. Maybe that kind of messes up appetite regulation, right? Maybe your brain goes, glucose is going down. Oh, we need more glucose to come in. We can't tolerate these drops in glucose. We can't really use fat all that well. You don't have another fuel source to switch. So let's make this crazy human crave more carbohydrates to keep them coming in. That's kind of called the glycostatic theory of appetite. And it's kind of been sort of disproven, but lipostatic theory was the same thing based on fats, and basically none of the simple theories really work out in something as complex as appetite regulation. But my gut feeling is it probably still plays a role. May not be the main thing, but I think it still does play a role.
I think it's an interesting point to make because, as you said, like people who are chronically stressed and kind of always have their foot on the gas, no matter how hard they work or how many calories they seem to eat, their body doesn't seem to make any sort of changes. And it's, as you said, like if their body is just unable to switch off from using carbohydrates as a fuel source and start to metabolize fat, they're just going to kind of be spinning their wheels.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed. Again, of course, I would love to see more data in that
Mm.
area, but I've done some metabolic testing on people, some surrogate testing, some blood glucose, some blood cams, looking at heart rate variability for markers of stress and things of that nature. And I don't know, just from anecdotal data, that I think there is something related to it.
Yeah, 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 definitely. So, I mean, putting this into practice for a kind of like a general population person, or even someone who's a bit of a weekend warrior, likes to think of themselves as an athlete without too much sort of competition. This is, would this be a case of, okay, well, you're going to monitor your carbohydrate level based on your activity. So, higher active days, higher intensity, you're going to be eating more carbohydrates. And then on lower active days, rest days, you're going to eat proportionately more fats to kind of balance things out.
I would say yes. So, a really simple template I use for most people to start off is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, do some type of weight training. You can even throw in like Wednesdays, maybe an easy dude bra day where you're just doing, old school bodybuilding type stuff or whatever.
Hmm.
And then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, some type of low intensity aerobic training, ideally fasted if you can. If you
Hmm.
can't get it done fasted, it's not going to be a deal breaker. By all means, getting it in is more important. If you have more time to train, even just a short session, I think in the morning can definitely help.
Hmm.
To can kind of play around with intensity on that in terms of aerobic training, especially if your
Hmm.
weight training is later in the afternoon, if you have time and capacity to do that.
Hmm.
Obviously, that could be as simple as just going for an AM fasted walk too. That's definitely a good exercise with that. And then for vast majority of people, I'll then oscillate calories based on that. So we'll
Okay.
set protein usually around zero point 0.7 grams per pound, right? What is that, like 1.6 grams per
Uh,
kg, somewhere around there, if I do
Yeah.
metric for all you people are not in the US because everyone else uses metric. Um, Fat, yeah, 70 to 90 grams per day, somewhere in there. Usually I go on the lower side to start. And then
Hmm.
I'll titrate carbohydrates based on their performance.
Right.
So exactly what you said on like the Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday days, they're really not needing a higher amount of carbohydrates. So I will actually cut carbohydrates from those days and I'll
Hmm.
leave them a little higher on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So what I have is it's actually kind of oscillating, or even to go back to like the 80s, they called it the Zigzag Method. And, kind of manipulation of caloric intake has been around for quite a while.
Hmm.
So I'll do that one. That's probably where I start most people. And then, from there, you kind of get fancy or not fancy. If someone is brand new and there's just a lot of habits they're trying to do, I just basically just make them isocaloric. Like every day, I want you to hit these kind of macros or these kind of foods. I
Hmm.
just do that for a while just because it's simple, see what pans out, maybe play with calories a little bit. And then I'll probably progress them into kind of more of a zigzag method.
Hmm.
If it's a little bit more advanced athlete I've been working with for a while, what I've been doing lately is taking 2 days. That is the higher amount of training. So if I've got a female client doing this right now, so her high carb days are Sunday and Monday, and her high amount of training is usually Monday, and then Tuesday she does some intervals. So
Hmm.
kind of trying to match the two high volume, heavy days, and she's doing some pretty intense wicked intervals on Tuesday. So after she's been pretty loaded on carbohydrates.
Hmm.
And in her case, I'll make those 2 days super high in carbs. So she'll be up to like 300 grams of carbohydrates on those days. And then the other days will be a little bit lower to moderate. Right now, she's a little bit higher. She's at like 270, I think, somewhere around there. But she was a little bit lower for a while with kind of cutting more at like around 180 grams or so.
Hmm.
That's based on some work from Dr. Bill Campbell's lab, which will be probably published sometime early next year.
Oh,
So what
cool.
they did is they did a group where they kind of staggered them, where they had the 2 days of higher carbohydrate intake, and the
Hmm.
other group they did not. And these are some relatively lean, active athletes already. What they found is those two higher carbohydrate days appeared to retain more lean body mass than compared to the other group.
Hmm.
Calories were equated, if I remember correctly, to be the same over both weeks. So some early data to show that in humans, maybe there's some good things that happen with having two higher days as opposed to just having all days be the same,
Hmm.
especially if you're trying to cut. So your overall calories are in more of a deficit.
Right. Okay. That's definitely interesting. What would you say what would you, I guess, hypothesize the mechanism of that being, that kind of 2 day high carb and then other days being pretty moderate carbohydrate?
Yeah, I talked to Dr. Campbell about it too, and don't know. It may be that maybe your performance is better on those days. So maybe you're
Yeah.
creating a little bit more of a stimulus to hold on to muscle. Maybe there's some interesting signaling effects with the muscle being quote unquote full
Hmm.
with glycogen from an anabolic signaling standpoint, possibly. Maybe compliance was just easier in that group because you got kind of more of a mental break because we know
Mm.
dietary recall, all that kind of stuff is, so, it's kind of the best we have in a lot of studies, but it's not perfect by any means.
No.
But most people can't be locked up in a metabolic ward for 5 months of their life either, or even 8 weeks,
Yeah.
both from getting subjects to do that and a compliance in terms of getting people not to drop out of the study, to cost, everything else.
Yeah.
So yeah, who knows? To be honest, they're in the process of looking at that.
Yeah. Very interesting. As you said, it could, um, there could be a big adherence effect of that, like,
Sure.
2 days almost like of a refeed, isn't it? Versus then 5 other days of a lower calorie amount, and you're then sort of sticking to it better. But it's definitely very interesting data going forward.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so talk a bit more. You talked about how metabolic inflexibility can be not just the inability to use fat, but the inability to use carbohydrate as well. So,
Correct.
so what situation does someone find themselves in where they can't use carbohydrates as fuel? And then is it a case of, to get out of that, is it very similar to what we just talked about with, trying to use fat as fuel? Is kind of easing yourself into it over time.
Uh, yes and no. So assuming they don't have a genetic disease, they don't have any weird pathologies, that kind of stuff. The
Hmm.
main place you actually see it is the use of ketogenic diets.
Right.
So for most of your listeners, they already know ketogenic diet, moderate to lowish protein, very, very high fat, very low carbohydrates. Most people need to be under 50 grams of carbs, which does include fiber and everything else.
Mm.
So if I have, what do you guys call them, biscuits over there? If I have 3 biscuits, I'm probably over my amount of carbohydrates. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
like
a
people know
term or
what they
not.
are. Yeah,
Yeah,
little like bread scones probably. It's the
yeah,
closest
yeah.
thing we have.
So 50 grams of carbs, very, very low.
Hmm.
So what happens with that? So some of the earliest studies they did looking at fat loading for performance. The thought was, oh, look at this long endurance exercise. Oh, I know. We're going to teach the body to use fat better as a fuel source, and we're going to create freaks and break all sorts of records. So they did some really early studies looking at 8 to 12 weeks, kind of a sort of ketogenic type diet, very high levels of fat. And what they saw was that they did upregulate the body's use of fat as a fuel. They're like,
Hmm.
cool, this is great. They go and test their performance. Man, no freaks. Crap. What did we miss? Oh, wait, maybe we should measure people who are doing higher intensity exercise. Because you think, like, even to me, like, I don't run marathons, but you would poll most people and you go, hey, what's the number one fuel used in a marathon? They'd be like, oh, it's got to be fat. However, if you look at elite level of marathon runners, it's literally 100% carbohydrates.
Hmm.
Right. So the recent, breaking of the 2 hour record, not official, all that kind of stuff. Wicked high amounts of carbs. Like 120 grams per hour. So very, very high amounts. They did a study in very high level half marathon runners. I think they gave them like nicotinamide acid to block the use of fat as a fuel, and
Hmm.
pretty much no change in their performance. Meaning that when they were running, they were using almost entirely carbohydrates.
Right.
Makes sense, right? If you look at the times elite marathon runners have, like their mile times are in like the sub 5 minutes, right? Just
Yeah.
crazy fast.
Yeah.
Um, so high amount of carbohydrates with that. So researchers go back and they go, oh man, we screwed this up. We got it. So we're going to fat adapt these people, and then we're going to give them a piss ton of carbohydrates right before the race. We're going to restore their glycogen, and they can use both fuels, and woohoo, we create lots of freaks.
Yeah.
Um, that didn't happen either. So then they're like, oh man, what did we do wrong? Oh, I know. Maybe we didn't give them enough carbohydrates. We didn't do a muscle biopsy. So maybe they need more carbohydrates than what we thought. Do another study, take 72, 48 hours, just give them more carbohydrates. stick needles in the vastus lateralis to pull out chunks of tissue to look at it and see how much glycogen is stored. Lots of glycogen stored, maximal levels. Woohoo! Lots of freaks. No freaks. They're like, oh shit, like what do we do wrong now? They should have lots of fat. They should have lots of carbohydrates. We did the biopsy. We pulled tissue. We showed that they have sufficient amount of glycogen.
Mm.
What kind of got missed is that if you do a high fat diet, a low carbohydrate diet, and even if you're training during that time period, you have a change in this enzyme, primarily it's called the PDH enzyme. So pyruvate dehydrogenase. In essence, it's just kind of the gatekeeper to glycolysis. Right? So glycolysis is the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. What happens if you put someone on a low carbohydrate diet, you're not using that carbohydrate end of the spectrum. So your body goes, screw it. I don't really use this end of the spectrum all that much. And you start moving away from it. So you get changes in this, what's called PDH enzyme, that actually starts down regulating glycolysis a little bit. Again, that's where the kind of 3 to 8, maybe 10% drop in speed and power happens because you're not using that end of the spectrum to its fullest degree. So even though you had replenished glycogen, you lost some of that carbohydrate machinery. So like Dr. Peter Attia says, it's like you have a big tanker truck full of gas that runs out of gas on the side of the road, right? It doesn't have access to the big tank in the back that it's taking to the gas station. Right? So what happens is you have an access issue, meaning that the substrate is present, but you're not able to access and to use it at 100% of it. So for people who've done ketogenic type diet, and they're like, well, I want to transition back to using more carbohydrates, they have that issue. They have another issue where the muscle can temporarily be more insulin resistant. Right? So most of the time we think of insulin resistance, we go, oh man, this is a bad thing. But it's called a non-pathological insulin resistance at the muscle level. In English, it just means that, we're on a ketogenic diet. There's not a lot of glucose running around in the body. The brain goes, I like glucose. I'm a greedy bastard. I want all the glucose. I don't want any muscles taking it. So if I make the muscles more insulin resistant, glucose has a harder time entering the muscle and it gets spared for the brain. So when you then give someone back a huge bolus of carbohydrates, all of a sudden, the muscle's not prepared to take in a lot of that glucose as a sink to dispose of it right away. And you can see kind of crazy fluctuations in blood glucose. Now, again, those are all temporary. They're not considered a pathology or a real health issue. They all do get reversed with training. How long does that take? No one really knows. It's pretty variable. I've talked to Dr. Dom D'Agostino about this too. But in English, what would you do if someone has that thing? I would look at entering, so what I do with clients, training, after training, I would then give them more carbohydrates.
Right.
Reason being, when we exercise muscle, we have translocation of GLUT4, goes out into the end of the muscle, and it says, hey, I want to pull in glucose. We know that training does that much better. There's also another mechanism called basically non-insulin mediated uptake. Just muscle movement in and of itself can actually pull blood glucose it can pull glucose right out of the bloodstream. So I would start with more carbohydrates post-training, maybe even towards the middle of training. You have to be kind of careful, make sure people don't go hypoglycemic. And then over time, I would just slowly kind of ramp up the amount of carbohydrates, making sure they still feel pretty good.
Cool.
A long-winded answer in more techie terms, but
hey, no, it was great. It explained it really, really well. Because as you said, there's been a big hype around the keto diet for a long time, and there still is. And so there'll be a lot of people that will have tried it for extended periods of time. And as you said, actually, if you're in a position where you're doing quite high intense training, you're shortchanging yourself of that carbohydrate, but then you're going to have to spend a fair bit of time getting used to the carbohydrate again to actually be able to use it.
Yeah. So an intermittent solution that almost no one talks about, which I have no idea why, is if you do a period of fasting where you do not consume any calories, that does not change that PDH enzyme.
Right.
So what I do with clients is, okay, we've got someone who they don't want to give up the speed and power end of the spectrum. Maybe they're a CrossFit competitor or whatever. But we did some testing and we realized that, oh, wow, their aerobic performance is kind of down. Yeah, they kind of need to get a little bit better on body composition also.
Mhm.
I personally wouldn't put them on a ketogenic diet because I don't want to sacrifice that training, that speed and power. So they need to hold on to that or maybe increase it a little bit. So like on the Tuesday, which is normally our low intensity day, I'll have them slowly work up to a 19 to 24-hour fast.
Mhm.
So what are we doing with fasting? A period of time we're not consuming any calories. When we do that, insulin levels go down and down and down, lower and lower. So it's a big kind of metabolic hammer to push you to use more fat.
Mhm.
Also, we've cut out 1 day's worth of calories, which is usually enough to see changes in body composition. If you have a slow run in, most people can actually do it. And the cool part is we can then come back like on Wednesday, the very next day, have a very hard training session, maybe later in the day. They could consume 300 grams of carbohydrates and be perfectly fine because
Mhm.
that PDH enzyme doesn't seem to change. Maybe because muscle glycogen levels don't drop that much. Maybe because it's very short term. Maybe because fat's not real high. We don't know. But that gives me an adaptation to say, what is the fastest or the biggest adaptation I can push to increase in the use of fat? But
Mhm.
I'm not compromising their overall performance or their carbohydrate use end of the spectrum either.
Right. Yeah. So you're getting the body using fat without then saying switching off the carbohydrate
Right.
switch completely. Yeah, because it's that chronic exposure then to a high fat, low carb diet, which will basically then say to the body will be like, right, I don't need this PDH enzyme anymore, and then that's when you've kind of taken it too far.
Yep. Yeah. You start seeing downturns away from carbohydrate metabolism. Correct.
Sure. I think what that was really interesting, what you clarified as well for the listeners out there in terms of endurance competitors and people who are running marathons and half marathons at a very fast pace, because it's like, well, it's a long distance, yes, but because of the intensity, they are burning 100% carbohydrate because of their
Oh,
VO2
yeah.
max. But
Yeah.
you could probably say that for even someone running a 3.5 hour marathon, because they are running it at their max speed.
Could be. Yeah, so I always ask people and say, "Hey, why do you want to run a marathon?" Right? And if you're like, "Oh yeah, I'm running this, super fast time already and qualified for Boston Marathon, whatever, and I want to get even faster." Okay. Or it's I just want to complete a marathon, not get kicked off the course.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'd like to lose 10 pounds in the process. Right? That's a completely different approach where that second case, depending upon what their innate aerobic capacity is, yeah, we
Hmm.
may do some interval stuff. We're probably going to do some carbohydrate stuff. But I can make a pretty good argument that just by pushing up their body's ability to use fat to a pretty high level, that may be
Hmm.
enough for that person to do pretty good. Anecdotally, they feel better. We don't have to be hyper worried about consuming a crap ton of carbohydrates and gut issues and other things that can potentially come with that. And it does, in my experience, make it easier. Now,
Hmm.
that person, that's two completely different approaches depending upon the context of the athlete that you're working with. I think
Sure.
that's where it gets confusing, right? Because everyone's like, oh, fats are the best fuel ever. Like, oh, unless we need speed and power. Oh, it's a marathon. We don't need speed and power. It's like, but the person who crossed the line first is still the winner, right?
Yeah.
So you still need some speed and power to a degree. So, and
Hmm.
that's where I think people get confused.
Yeah. And would you say that even for if we started talking about like ultra marathons and Ironmans and even sort of longer and longer endurance events, it's probably still going to be the same case for the people who are at the front of the line?
Probably, although I agree that you can make an argument that the longer the race is, the less important carbohydrates are because your overall pace is going to be slower.
Hmm.
But having said that, I mean, like you look at like Zach Bittner and other, high level ultra marathon athletes, he does very cyclic type of approach, especially in the off season. But during the
Hmm.
races and leading up to it, he does consume a fair amount of carbohydrates. Does he consume as many as other elite racers? Probably not, or doesn't appear
Hmm.
to. Appears to be doing quite well, but I wouldn't agree that he's racing under a ketogenic or high fat condition. At least not that
Sure.
I've seen so far. The only time I can think of a time where being like in a very ketogenic state would be best for performance. I think if you had to carry all your supplies with you at the same time, right? So there's some
Hmm.
crazy 24-hour multi-day events, whether it's, kayaking and doing crazy stuff like that. And if you have to carry all your supplies at the same time,
Hmm.
from an efficiency standpoint in packing fuel, fat is way more dense and takes up way less space and weighs a lot less than carbohydrates.
Hmm.
So if you could be 100% more fat adapted keto person doing that, I think that may give you an advantage just because the fuel you're carrying may offset and make you more efficient overall.
Sure. Yeah, no,
But
good
there's not
point.
many of those races, so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a good point though. As you said, it's a case of still being able to use both as best as possible, and
Yeah,
it's
that's my argument. Yeah.
yeah, no, which is great. I guess the last question would be: you mentioned earlier a little bit about if people don't have any sort of pathological issues or things like that, and in in your research and your experience, have there been certain things when people are growing up that could affect their metabolic flexibility if they were to get unwell? Like if they were to suffer from, let's say, something like cancer and have to go through chemo or something like that. Would that then affect their ability to do this in later life because of just the treatment that they've gone through?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know. Um, Anecdotally, I have worked with a couple cancer survivors. Both of them did have chemo.
Hmm.
Again, small number, but I've talked to other post chemo people, and they seem to report similar symptoms. I haven't looked at
Hmm.
any of the published literature on it. But if we look at what chemotherapy does, probably targets inadvertently a lot of mitochondria. Most of the people, when they were done, they just felt like their overall energy level, and this is even years after the treatments,
Hmm.
that were just much, much lower than what they were beforehand. So I've often wondered if, chemo maybe knocks out more mitochondria than we realize.
Right.
Um, so a few of them kind of taking them through just, old school kind of aerobic base building and trying to get their aerobic capacity kind of back up.
Hmm.
Again, that's just anecdotal from just a handful of people of what I've seen.
Sure. No, no, it's a good answer. I guess it's treating them like anyone else, isn't it? And seeing what their capacity is like, and then building it up over time, as you said.
Yeah, and it could be just, maybe a coincidence that their aerobic base wasn't very good. But,
Hmm.
again, both of them reported that their energy level, even a couple of years after treatment, was way lower than what it was before. Usually, to me, that's a hallmark that your aerobic capacity is probably not where you want it to be. Right.
Hmm.
And obviously, mitochondria, all the kind of sexy terms now. And if you want to increase mitochondria, the best way to do it is aerobic training. Actually,
Yeah.
strength training, even metcons, things of that nature, probably won't increase mitochondrial development, which is
Hmm.
kind of shocking to a lot of people. So you can't just lift weights faster and expect to have an amazing aerobic capacity.
No, you've got to do actually aerobic work.
Yeah, go figure, huh?
No, exactly. I love what you said earlier, though, about for a lot of people, it could just be going for a walk fasted in the morning. So,
Yeah.
hey, it's more reasons to get a dog and take him for a walk in the morning.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be anything heroic, right? We're talking about low intensity. For
Exactly.
someone who hasn't done formal exercise and barely walks to their mailbox, walking to their mailbox back and forth twice may be aerobic training for them.
Mhm.
For other people, you may need to do more than that, but it doesn't necessarily need to be super complicated or complex.
No, no, great. Mike, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I think the listeners are going to get a lot from this. Is there anywhere that you would like to particularly direct them? Where can they find more about you and your work?
Yeah, best place is the website, which is just miketnelson.com. So MIKETNELSON.com. At the very top there, there'll be a little box where you can opt in and get onto the newsletter. Most information I have goes out over the newsletter. So I'd probably the best way. I do have a certification, which is primarily on the nutrition recovery side, everything from protein to fasting to sleep, things of that nature. And that's at flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. We can go there and get on the wait list and notified once that opens. And yeah, those are probably the two best places.
Great. Nice. Well, thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.